Good morning and welcome everyone to day 4 of the Modern Slavery webinars. My name is Jason Grove. I'm a Modern Slavery Coordinator with the National Modern Slavery Police Transformation team. And it gives a great pleasure to open this seminar, which is part of the Anti-Slavery Week, accumulating the Anti-Slavery Day on the 18th of October tomorrow. So welcome everyone, and especially to those that have signed into the majority of the webinars this week. Today we've got an excellent couple of speakers to talk to you about internet-enabled criminality and offender tracking technology. So you're in for a good hour or so on the webinar. Just a couple of things, if I may. You'll find yourselves are on mute, but please send your questions in and they'll be picked up by Nicola, who's helping facilitate this from Public Health England. And also, just before you sign off at the very end, we've got 2 polls just to get some feedback on what you thought of the webinar. So if you could just complete those couple of questions just before we sign off, that'd be much appreciated. So without further ado, if I can hand you over to, I think it's Joe on first from the Joint Slavery Trafficking Analysis Centre at the NTA. Thank you, Joe.
Thanks, Jason. I'm Joe Evans. I'm from the Joint Slavery and Trafficking Analysis Centre, as Jason said. We're a unit within the National Assessment Centre in the NCA, and JSTAC was formed in 2017 with the Police Transformation Unit, and brought together analysts, expertise, and data from several agencies. So we're made up of analysts from Border Force, Immigration Enforcement, the National Crime Agency, National Policing, and we also have slots for HMRC, the Gangmasters and Labour Abuse Authority, and we're seeking support from DWP as well. The role of JSTAC is to reflect the single authoritative picture of threat of MSHT in the UK and overseas, affecting the UK's interests. Now, what I'm going to talk to you about today is MSHT enabled by the internet. So we're going to cover how offenders work, looking at the overarching offending model which is adopted, how the enablers within that model interact with the internet, and we're going to cover both direct and indirect enablers, which I'll define a bit later on, and the different stages of the model and how the internet is used in those. We'll then go on to talk about how we can use the internet to identify the threat and how the threat's likely to evolve in the next 5 to 10 years, and also shorter term. So we'll look at the MSHT offending model now. So this is an overarching model which details the drivers, enablers, and key roles in almost every offender's operating model. So this is a piece of work which we carried out around 18 months ago now. And although it doesn't go into great detail in terms of exploring those enablers, what it does do is illustrate the complexity and reach of almost every MSHT operation. So you'll see that the key stages of the MSHT process are the sourcing and recruitment of victims, the movement and smuggling of them, exploitation, and finances and reward. And within those stages we see all of the enablers within the next layer. Surrounded by control, which can be both kind of carrot and stick, for want of a better phrase. We see expectation of reward, violence, fear, debt bondage, and lack of knowledge at the core of many operations. But how does this interact with the internet? So here we've highlighted the enablers which necessarily or almost exclusively interact with the internet. So of course, internet recruitment uses the internet, but the use of mobile communications is increasingly making use of internet technology with the emergence of encrypted communications such as WhatsApp. Advertisement for for recruitment purposes. And then later on in the model, we see mobile communications again. They're key throughout the whole model. Adult services websites, and the use of cryptocurrencies. So these ones necessarily require the internet, but the next lot that have been circled kind of in a hollow circle are ones which increasingly we see interact with the internet. So accommodation is not necessarily internet enabled, but the provision of that accommodation is increasingly so. We've seen the emergence of so-called pop-up brothels, which make use of short-term lets through platforms such as Airbnb and HomeAway. Food, toiletries and healthcare, much like the rest of society, we increasingly see individuals and offenders using the internet to facilitate the delivery of those. And bank accounts. While we all use internet banking, we are increasingly seeing banks which enable people to set up the account without ever having set foot in a branch. So we'll have a look now more at what these enablers actually mean for us as kind of responders to the threat. Now, as you'll have seen on the last few slides, the use of the internet occurs in all aspects and all stages of the MSHT offending model. But those can be split into direct enablers and indirect enablers. So direct enablers we've defined as those enablers which directly increase the profitability or scalability of the model, or significantly alter the nature of that model. Indirect enablers, on the other hand, are primarily adopted out of convenience and don't create a wholesale change in the profitability, scalability, or nature of the model. These can often be replicated by offline methods without a significant impact on offending, which does kind of introduce questions over how to respond to them, as the model can be so easily adapted within a short period of time. It's highly likely that the majority of internet enablers are adopted due to convenience or availability and do not significantly impact the profitability, scalability, or nature of offending. But there are some which, although adopted out of convenience, have had an effect on the model. Firstly, we'll look at communication first. So there's a few examples of the internet-enabled communication software which we increasingly see in MSHT operations. Some of these use voice over internet protocol, and many of them are over-the-top platforms, which are essentially internet technologies which have taken the place of traditional communications methods. So that's the likes of WhatsApp, which has taken the place of SMS messaging. And so essentially they don't necessarily introduce something new from the offender's perspective, but what they do introduce potentially is challenges to responders. They enable contacts between offenders, victims, and the public. And the public aspect is something that's unique to MSHT offending, where offenders necessarily need to interact with the public to maintain their model. As I've just mentioned, they're often encrypted, which creates challenges for law enforcement in terms of accessing that data in a timely manner. And again, it's highly likely these are adopted primarily because of affordability, because WhatsApp provides a free mechanism for communicating internationally, but also the familiarity and availability, rather than concerns over security. There are encrypted platforms out there which are kind of optimized for criminal use, but these, because of that public element and the necessity to interact with the public and also recruit from the public, we don't see these adopted as widely in MSHT offending as we do in other forms of criminality. We'll move on to talk about recruitment now. So this is the most commonly recorded use of internet within MSHT offending models outside of adult services websites. Advertising for recruitment purposes often facilitates initial contact with victims only, rather than forming the entirety of the recruitment process. And so when we talk about online recruitment, what we often are talking about is simply a Facebook advert or an advert on a forum or classified site, which causes the victim to approach the offender, at which point communication goes offline using more traditional methods. It's highly likely that in the majority of cases, an offline element remains key in recruiting and placing a victim into a situation of exploitation. Part of the reason for that is because of the necessity for a level of trust to be built between the victim and offender before that trust can later be exploited. The most common methods of recruitment advertising are social media, and often these are in closed nationality-based groups. For example, almost every city in the UK has got a group, for example, Romanians in Birmingham, and that's replicated across every city and every kind of large non-English language speaking community. So that introduces challenges for kind of oversight of those groups, both in terms of translation, but also access. We also see classified advertising, which is more common overseas, through the use of the equivalent of Gumtree for whatever the nationality we're looking at uses. Largely, recruitment is predicated on vague promises of good work, and don't go into the type of work which will be conducted, the conditions, or the pay to be expected. However, some do provide this detail. Where that detail is provided, it's in labour exploitation, it's often accurate. So if you're told you're going to work in a car wash, you're likely to end up in a car wash. Deception is more common when we start to look at sexual exploitation, which is likely because of the fewer responses that will be gained for people wanting to kind of willingly engage in sex work. Although we do still see those adverts where it's openly stated that a victim will be required to work in the sex industry. Now move on to look at control. Now, this is an area where internet technologies are not often recorded. However, there are technologies out there which are highly likely to present some opportunities. So we'll look at those. So firstly, there's remote threats to families. So as MSHT is often an international crime, and victims can be controlled through means such as threats to families. Their families may well be located overseas. It's almost certain that where these threats do occur, they make use of the internet, either to make the threat direct to the family member or to coordinate with another OCG member who can then make that threat in person, in country. However, it's likely that many victims who have limited family contact can be controlled by reported threats to family members rather than the actual issuance of threats. So what we mean by that is that although we often see threats to family recorded, it's likely that this is overstated, as the victim may well have been told that their family member is threatened, but because they're not in contact with that family member, they're none the wiser to the fact that they actually haven't. However, when we're looking at threats to family members, it's a realistic possibility that a victim's social media footprint enables offenders to identify details of their family situation and tailor threats to create an illusion of authenticity. We'll now move on to look at blackmail. So offenders often threaten to inform family members that victims are sex workers. This is particularly prevalent in sexual exploitation. We haven't seen this to the same extent in labour exploitation, and it's especially prevalent in child sexual exploitation. It's highly likely that online-enabled models of sexual exploitation, so that includes both contact and non-contact sexual services. So contact we refer to traditional sex work or prostitution, which is advertised online, and non-contact we refer to webcam services, and so on. So these allow offenders to maintain control due to the likely embarrassment caused to victims through the sharing of images, and those images are undoubtedly in the offender's possession, given the necessity for them to advertise the services. Within county lines offending as well, the filming of sexual acts for blackmail and humiliation has been identified, particularly against female victims. It's almost certain that where this methodology is used, the use of internet platforms features within the threat or act of sharing the images, and that's something which we've seen quite comprehensively over an extended period of time in child sexual exploitation. And finally, we'll move on to look at surveillance. So it's a realistic possibility that offenders are able to track and monitor victims using GPS-enabled apps. It's almost certain that this form of surveillance would only be necessary in a minority of offending models, and those offending models would be ones where the victim is required to work remotely from offenders. So that would include forced acquisitive crime, commercial sexual exploitation, where the victim is providing outcall services. We actually haven't identified confirmed cases where surveillance has been used in this way, GPS surveillance that is. And although so in county lines it was deemed to be a significant risk for this. Although mobile devices used to facilitate drug supply in county lines offending, those phones generally don't have GPS capability, but victims are highly likely to possess their own handsets which will contain GPS-enabled apps. Victims are highly unlikely to willingly install dedicated tracking software onto their own devices, but it's a realistic possibility that GPS-enabled social media platforms, such as Snapchat's Snap Map, or for kind of an overseas equivalent, WeChat's Friends Map. So these sorts of platforms where they provide that capability, but not for the overt purpose of surveillance, these are likely to provide opportunities for offenders. But again, something that we haven't seen evidenced, and certainly not evidenced widely. So across all of these control methodologies which are enabled by the internet, actually offenders are unlikely to adopt remote working or the associated technologies unless the model necessitates. So what we mean by that is that if the model prior to the internet didn't require a victim to work on their own, the internet is unlikely to have persuaded the offenders to let the victims work alone. Now this is because of the there's an inherent risk that where victims work alone, they may escape. So although internet technologies do pose these opportunities, they're unlikely to use them where in-person control mechanisms can kind of maintain a greater level of control. Move on to look at exploitation now. So adult services websites are a key and direct enabler of commercial sexual exploitation. JSTAC have carried out quite significant amounts of work on adult services websites. Now, while they are a key and direct enabler of commercial sexual exploitation, that's largely because of the client base which they provide an offender access to and the profitability that follows from that. disruption of adult services websites, as seen in America with the close down of Backpage.com last year, is highly likely to drive additional vulnerability to those victims who are trafficked. That's because the disruption of a single site is unlikely to completely cut off the demand, completely remove the viability of offending, but it will make an impact on the profitability of offending, certainly in the short term. So what follows on from that is an offender's requirement to recover lost revenue from elsewhere in the model. And this might be by cutting healthcare provision, might be by using worse accommodation, but also if the viability of an online model is disrupted, we may also see a shift to older, more traditional methodologies such as on-street sex work, which introduces a whole new layer of vulnerability. Webcam services also exist in the UK, and although they're not frequently reported in the UK, they do almost certainly provide opportunities for exploitation. And a recent documentary looking at webcam service providers in the UK found that they are able to make up to and occasionally in excess of £1,000 per day for around 6 hours work. So just illustrating that profitability, and that income is after the platform has taken their commission. Now, although that's kind of the top end of the marketplace, it does undoubtedly illustrate the vulnerability that there is there. Offenders operating in labour exploitation and commercial sexual exploitation, though, are almost certain to make use of internet enablers that mirror legitimate operators in the same marketplace. So going back to adult services websites, for example, the reason that there's such a huge client base there is because there's so many independent sex workers making use of the same technology, and also making use of the positives that come with that, such as the ability to vet clients prior to meeting them. When we look at labour exploitation, advertising is likely to take place using classified sites such as Gumtree, but also adverts on Google Maps and Apple Maps and so on to advertise your local car wash, your nail bar, etc. And also Yell and similar kind of telephone directories to advertise more formalized services, if you like, such as construction, etc. Offenders, the general public and offenders alike are increasingly using online services to obtain the necessary services and items to maintain a model of exploitation. They're almost certain to do this out of convenience, that's both offenders and the public alike, with offline methods often remaining in existence. So accommodation is one. We're still able to walk into hotels and book a night on the desk, but the reality is that the vast majority of hotel bookings are accommodated through online models, online platforms. Also, the provision of contraception in sexual exploitation cases, food and taxis, also largely in sexual exploitation cases. So food, we see the use of Deliveroo, Just Eat, and so on. And taxis can conveniently provide an offender with a way to centrally control all bookings for all victims from a single device. Flights, much like accommodation, we can still walk into an airport and book the flight, or we can go into a travel agent, but the vast majority are facilitated by online bookings. And also employment agencies, so where we see intermediary or non-employer models of labour exploitation, online listings are used to identify vacancies into which victims can be placed. Some offenders do continue to use offline methods to identify this employment, but as a result of some of the kind of positive work which has gone on with employment agencies and educating them on some of the indicators of exploitation, that's decreasing, but does still occasionally crop up. Now, while the majority of these enablers that I've just discussed are kind of secondary enablers or indirect enablers and haven't affected the profitability or significantly affected the profitability or affected the model, there is a key exception to that, and that is the use of short-term letting platforms such as Airbnb. What this has provided is access to higher-end sexual services marketplaces, as kind of the quality of the accommodation often goes hand in hand with the rate which can be charged for an hour or an evening with a victim. Finally, we'll talk about online finances. Offenders can monitor and control the finances of victims and the offending businesses, centrally through a single device. Now, where we see offenders needing to set up multiple bank accounts for multiple victims, this is particularly convenient as a result of that central control and central oversight of the finances of victims and the overall OCG. Increasingly, bank accounts can be set up remotely over the internet through banks such as Monzo, and while these are likely primarily adopted out of convenience, it does remove a key identification point, which is where historically we've identified exploitation by bank staff seeing kind of the coaching of victims. It does remove this opportunity, but potentially introduced an online alternative. We also see cryptocurrency in a few cases, but this isn't widely adopted by MSHT offenders. It's very limited use and is used to either meet costs or realise profits in offending models. It's highly likely that the required technological understanding and the instability of the current established cryptocurrencies prevent a more widespread use by offenders. But what we're increasingly seeing is social media platforms introducing payment mechanisms, and you may have seen in the news very recently around Facebook seeking to set up their own cryptocurrency. So as that kind of market penetration increases, or if it increases, that's when we'd more likely see offenders adopting cryptocurrency more widely. But on the social media platforms, a key social media platform which includes payment services is WeChat. So this allows several payment services to operate. It's highly likely that these provide offenders with the opportunity to transfer funds between offenders and clients purchasing the services of victims, and also victims. And this can take place internationally, immediately, and in many cases free of charge. So that kind of sums up all of the enablers which we've looked at in terms of their viability and the extent to which they've been adopted. But what can we actually do to identify the online threat? Now, a single service provider is highly unlikely to provide a reliable indicator of offending. It's actually through patterns of internet use and patterns of use of that service provider that we're more likely to provide reliable indicators. Now, the main reason for this is because almost all of the service providers we've discussed also provide services to the general public. and in many cases the same service. And so a single transaction or a single use of a platform will not tell us an awful lot. What we need to do is understand the direct enablers without which offenders have to adapt their models. Each of these direct enablers will need a bespoke approach. As I previously mentioned, adult services websites being a direct enabler, we've carried out quite a lot of work within law enforcement looking at how we can drive up the standards and drive up the identification of exploitation on those platforms. But every other direct enabler, such as Airbnb, Airbnb being kind of the standout one which we need to look at, and also webcamming platforms, they'll need their own bespoke approach as well. But what we could explore further as well is early intervention. So if a victim is using social media to seek employment, or indeed any other platform, that means that that victim has got an online footprint. That online footprint can be used to target prevent messaging. Something which I've spotted a few times, kind of a personal anecdote here, is some organizations are using LinkedIn to spread the message of modern slavery, etc. And that's great. It informs industry, it informs key stakeholders and key partners. But I have also seen people using LinkedIn to share indicators of exploitation, which should really be shared with a victim. Is a victim seeking work in a car wash likely to be on LinkedIn? Just a little anecdote and a little question to perhaps ask and think about how we as kind of responders more broadly can tailor our approach and make sure that we're reaching the right people at the right time. Looking to the future, the first thing we have to acknowledge with this is, although the last half an hour or so might have been a bit bleak, the internet use will continue. The internet's not going away for any of us, and offenders are no different. It's almost certain that offenders' use of the internet will increase in line with that of the general public. Again, that interaction with the public in part driving that, and it's highly likely that they will change in line with the general public. So something we're seeing at the moment is increasing use of apps and mobile optimized websites, and we're likely to kind of see less and less laptops that need to be seized and more phones that need to be seized. But also, as awareness of data security increases within society, it's likely that offenders will increasingly adopt more sophisticated and more heavily protected internet platforms. Offenders may also increase the use of technology to kind of obfuscate activity, although this is likely to only affect the top end of offending. So that concludes the presentation. Just to go over again what we've discussed, so how offenders work and the breadth of those enablers which we see in all offending models. We define direct and indirect enablers, so those which have introduced further profitability or scalability of a model, and those which are primarily there out of convenience. And we've looked through all of the stages of the model: recruitment, communication, control, exploitation, and money, and then discussed briefly, given the amount of detail we can go into, how we can identify and respond to the threat and how that threat's likely to evolve in the future. Thank you for your attention, and I'll now have a look if there are any questions.